Goodness, friends, I think we're at the last leg of this marathon. That is essay number 142. So we've been reading this huge book on American miscellany, and it is a miscellaneous collection of essays published in 1865. And a part of the miscellaneousness is that these essays are of varying lengths. This is certainly the longest one we've encountered. I've had to kind of chop it up, and hopefully this fourth installation will be the last. You know, it's an interesting story, very, very detailed. So we go on because we're strong, because we are excited about American miscellany. All right, friends, let's pick up here on page 359. We were talking about Columbus on his third journey, I believe. He found a quantity of fresh water flowing into the Gulf, that it must come from some continent of vast extent, which he still maintained to be a part of Asia. All right, so Christopher Columbus, tell us more. From his brother, who had governed the island under the title of Adelantado, Columbus received an account of the events which had occurred during his long absence. Bartholomew had proceeded to found a fort near the mines of Haina, discovered by his servant. But from want of provisions, the work had made slow progress. He then laid the foundation of San Domingo on the harbor of the mouth of the Ozema River, and leaving a small garrison there, set out to explore the western region of the land. He was well received by the cacique of that district, who readily agreed to pay an annual tribute of cotton, alleging that no gold was produced in his part of the island. On returning to Isabella, he found nothing but misery and repining. The provisions received from Europe were consumed. The Spaniards, intent only on procuring gold, would not condescend to cultivate the ground. Surprise. And yet, by their cruelties, had driven the natives to the mountains. Again, big surprise. The Adelantado sent all the men that could be spared into the interior, where the climate was more salubrious and provisions in greater abundance. He then established military posts to overawe the natives, whose indignation was roused anew by fresh indignities. 2 friars had labored with small success to convert the Indians, who could not be persuaded that a religion was true whose followers perpetrated such atrocities. Yeah, no shit. In one place, however, the friars had built a small chapel with crucifix, images, and altar for the use of a family of converts. Some other Indians had, however, entered the chapel and broken the images. For this crime, the ignorant savages were tried by the ecclesiastical law, condemned, and burnt. This cruel treatment excited the indignation of the natives, of course, and a rebellion to commence by a general massacre of their oppressors was concerted. It was betrayed, as usual, to the Spaniards, and by a successful stratagem, the Adelantado seized 14 of the assembled caciques and carried them prisoners to a fortress. 2 of the principal instigators of the insurrection were put to death, but the others were released, an act of clemency which for a time restored tranquility to the Vega. Bartholomew then set out to the western extremity of the island, where he received for tribute sufficient cotton and provisions to load a caravel. A new trouble arose from the machinations of one Francisco Roldan, who, raised from a low rank to be chief judge of the island, now turned his influence against his benefactor. During the absence of the Adelantado, He excited mutiny against him among the Spaniards at Isabella, and on his return set out into the interior, where he had formed a friendship with the native chiefs, and hoped to seize one of the forts. Disappointed by the vigilance of the commander, he now endeavored to obtain possession of it by force. The Adelantado marched to its relief, but distrusting the loyalty of his men, durst not attack Roldan. He had an interview with him which led to no result, and Roldan, taking advantage of his absence, returned to Isabella, entered it by surprise, and breaking open the royal warehouse, supplied himself and his followers with arms and clothing. He then returned to the Vega, endeavoring to seduce the followers of the Adelantado from their allegiance. Not succeeding in this, he again endeavored to stir up the natives to a revolt, and continued to sow discontent among the Spaniards. The whole island was reduced to a state of anarchy, when 2 vessels arrived at San Domingo in February 1498 with supplies of provisions, troops, and, what was of more importance, a royal confirmation of the authority of the Adelantado. Roldan had, however, gone too far to hope for pardon, and feeling too weak for resistance, retired to the west end of the island. The Indians in the Vega, seduced by his machinations, had taken up arms, but being defeated by the Spaniards, their chief fled to the mountains of Sigue, where he found shelter with a brother cacique. Thither he was followed by the Adelantado, who, notwithstanding the difficulties of a mountain warfare with savage foes, soon dispersed the Indians and captured both the chiefs, who had sought shelter in the recesses of the mountains. Such was the state of the island when Columbus returned thither from Spain, and such the immediate results of the unwise policy which the Spanish monarchs, instigated by his private enemies, pursued toward him. The productiveness of the colony was ruined. Discontent, disloyalty, and crime fomented among the white settlers, and the poor Indians led into rebellions in which they either perished miserably by the sword and famine, or were reduced to a state of cruel slavery, to which death in almost any form was preferable. Such was the condition of affairs in Hispaniola when Columbus returned from Spain. Instead of the paradise which it seemed when the white man first set foot on its soil, it had become the abode of war and sedition and strife and famine and pestilence, and that's what happens with the white man. The native population was melting away before the baleful presences of the stranger, and their once hospitable towns were desolate and silent. The Spaniards, too, were now reaping the fruit of their crimes. Vice had produced disease, indolence, poverty, while cruelty and oppression had turned the once friendly Indians into deadly foes, and the thickly peopled country into a lonely wilderness. Columbus endeavored to restore matters as far as was still possible. He denounced Roldan as a rebel, but at the same time offered him pardon on immediate submission. Roldan had, however, strengthened his party by the accession of many criminals who had been sent from Spain at the same time as Columbus, but had arrived in the island before him and now refused to submit, as criminals do. Columbus, surrounded by treachery and disaffection, was too weak to enforce compliance, and could only write home an account of the rebellion and ask further aid. After various negotiations, an agreement was made with the rebels by which they were to return within a limited time to Spain, and the admiral set out to inspect the island. Circumstances delayed the fitting out of the ships, and Columbus soon learned that new seditions had broken out among the rebels, who refused to leave the island. A cold letter from the court added to his perplexities, as it showed the power of his enemies there, and how little trust could be put in the royal favor. He had thus to comply with all the demands of the mutineers, and enter into a new arrangement, reinstating Roldan in his office of chief judge, giving grants of land to some of his followers, and sending others of them home to Spain. To both parties, Indians were assigned as slaves, and instead of tribute, the free natives were compelled to cultivate the land of the Spaniards settled in their vicinity. This treatment of the Indians is one of the greatest stains on the memory of Columbus, and shows how little the rights of humanity and the duties of Christianity were understood in that age. By the same vessels that carried home the conspirators, Columbus sent letters to the king, detailing all that had occurred, showing that the sovereign was not bound by the engagements he had made with the rebels, and requesting aid to restore tranquility, and a learned man to act as judge of the island. 4 vessels had been seen off the west part of the island, which Columbus learned were commanded by Ojeda, the bold cavalier already mentioned. He sent Roldan to inquire into this suspicious expedition, who gladly undertook the enterprise as likely to secure possession of his ill-gotten gains. Roldan met Ojeda and found that he had a license from Fonseca. Okay, so Ojeda had a license from Fonseca that the vessels were fitted out as private adventure, and that they had already sailed along the coast of the mainland from 200 leagues east of the Orinoco to the Gulf of the Paria. In this expedition was a Florentine merchant, Amerigo Vespuccio, destined to give a name to the whole of this new world. Ojeda promised to meet the admiral at San Domingo, but instead of this, as soon as he had collected provisions, he sailed to Charagua. I'll be honest, I don't know how to say that. Haragua. It's Xara Gua. Gua. Xaragua. Haragua, maybe? He sailed to Haragua, Haragua, where many of the mutinous followers of Roldan were settled. These men chose him for a leader and were about to march with him to San Domingo for a redress of their grievances, when their old leader, with a band of resolute followers, arrived in their neighborhood. Ojeda retired to his ships, and after various maneuvers between 2 such well-matched opponents, had to leave the island, but not till he had landed in several places and plundered the poor natives. Ojeda, it appears, afterward sailed to Puerto Rico and carried off numbers of the Indians, whom he sold in the slave market of Cadiz. Meantime, another conspiracy broke out. Guevara, a young cavalier, had been banished from San Domingo for his licentious conduct. But there being no vessel to take him to Spain, licentious. Does that mean horny? Licentious conduct. But there being no vessel to take him to Spain, was sent for a time to Haragua. Here he fell in love with a daughter of Canaboa. with the daughter of Caonabo, the Carib chief, and intended to marry her, when Roldan, it is said, from jealousy, interfered. Roldan first sent him to another place, but he returned, and on his submission was allowed to remain. He, however, engaged in a conspiracy for having its object to kill Roldan or put out his eyes. But the experienced rebel was beforehand with them, seized the ringleaders, and sent them prisoners to the admiral. Guevara's uncle, Mojica, a former comrade of Roldan, incensed at this action, began to collect his old followers to free his nephew. Hold on, I'm just kind of excited about they either wanted to kill him or put out his eyes. Like, honestly, that's all I think putting out his eyes really solves a lot of problems for men in general. Okay, so he wanted to put out his eyes, but the experienced rebel was beforehand with them, seized the ringleaders and sent them prisoners to the admiral. Guevara's uncle, Mojica, a former comrade of Roldan, incensed at this action, began to collect his old followers to free his nephew, but was anticipated by Columbus, who fell upon him suddenly and seized him and his principal confederates. Mojica was put to death, some others condemned, but retained in confinement, and the Adelantado, seconded by Roldan, soon reduced the whole island to a state of tranquility. This, however, was not to continue long. The enemies of Columbus were busy at court, where his friends were few and powerless. Ferdinand had undertaken these discoveries from no high or generous motive, but moved only by hopes of wealth, which he now found greatly disappointed. Instead of receiving supplies from them, they were a constant drain on his treasury, already exhausted by his numerous wars. His disappointed avarice made him lend a ready ear to all the accusations brought against Columbus by the idle, dissolute men who returned home. Many of these persons flocked to court, demanding arrears of pay, while their conduct in the colony had only deserved punishment. Their insolence may be judged of from the imprecations with which they saluted the two sons of Columbus, who attended court as pages to the Queen. "There go," they would exclaim, "the sons of the admiral, the whelps of him who discovered the land of vanity and delusion, the grave of Spanish hidalgos." The Queen had long been his faithful friend, but her humanity was excited by the treatment of the Indians, whom Columbus persisted in sending home as slaves. She ordered them all to be returned to their native land, and gave her consent to a commission to inquire into the conduct of the admiral. One principal object of this appointment on the part of Ferdinand was his wish to obtain some excuse for depriving Columbus of the high privilege with which he had invested him. Like many other wicked men, he sought to cover one act of ingratitude and injustice by adding it to another. The person chosen for this purpose was Francesco de Bobadilla, whom some represent as a very honest and religious man, others, with more semblance of truth, as needy, passionate, and ambitious. He was empowered to examine into the late rebellion and the government of the admiral and his brothers, and on finding them guilty, to supersede them in the administration. With the latter part of this commission, Bobadilla was not long of complying. He reached San Domingo on the 23rd of August, 1500, and having landed on the next morning, ordered his commission to be read, authorizing him to investigate the late rebellion. Columbus was absent in the interior, but his brother Diego refused to give up the prisoners till his return, and asked for a copy of this letter to be sent to him. Bobadilla refused this, and next morning read a second royal patent investing him with the government of the island, and again demanded the prisoners. Diego replied that he held the prisoners in obedience to the admiral, who was invested with higher powers, on which Bobadilla produced a third mandate from the crown, ordering Columbus and his brothers to deliver up to him all the fortresses, ships, and other royal property, and a fourth mandate ordering him to pay all arrears of wages to persons in the royal service, which was received with shouts of applause by the multitude. He again demanded the prisoners, and when they were refused, repaired to the fort where they were confined. The alcalde, Miguel Diaz, had the gates closed, and appearing on the wall, declared that he would obey his lord the admiral only. Declared that he would obey his lord the admiral only. Enraged beyond measures, Bobadilla assembled his followers into order to storm the fort, which, having no garrison, he entered without resistance. He then took possession of the house of Columbus and seized upon all his effects, books, and private papers. When information of these events reached the admiral, he considered them merely the acts of some private adventurer and moved towards San Domingo. He was met by an alcalde who, proclaiming Bobadilla's accession to office, but the new governor took no notice of him and did not even answer a letter he had written. Columbus was in great uncertainty how to act, when 2 messengers arrived with a royal letter of credence commanding him to give implicit faith and obedience to Bobadilla, and presented at the same time a summons from the latter to appear before him. Columbus at once obeyed, but on reaching the town was seized, put in irons, and confined in the fortress. When the irons were brought, no one was found to put them on him, till the task was undertaken by one of his own domestics, a graceless and shameless cook, who riveted the fetters with as much readiness and alacrity as though he were serving him with choice and savory viands. Got some hatred back there. All right. His 2 brothers met the same fate, being also put in irons and confined separately on board a caravel. Bobadilla never came to see them, or gave them any account of the crimes with which they were charged, so that, in the admiral's own words, they were thrown into a ship loaded with irons and with little clothing and much ill treatment, without being summoned or convicted by justice. Such was the reward Columbus received from his unworthy sovereign, whom it is in vain to defend by throwing the blame on the miserable instrument of his malice and ingratitude. To justify his conduct, Bobadilla collected evidence from all quarters against the admiral and his brothers, to whom all the late disturbances in the island were imputed. When this was completed, he sent Columbus home in charge of Alonso de Viejo, an honorable officer. When he came to conduct him on board, Columbus, knowing the inveteracy of his enemies, thought it was to lead him to the scaffold. "Viejo," he said mournfully, whither are you taking me?" "To the ship, your excellency, to embark," replied the other. "To embark?" repeated the admiral earnestly. "Viejo, do you speak the truth?" "By the life of your excellency, it is true," replied the honest officer. With these words, the admiral was comforted, and felt as one restored from death to life. Such is the account of this touching incident, which Washington Irving has taken from Las Casas, who probably received it from his friend Vallejo himself. Columbus left the island early in October, shackled like the vilest of culprits, amid the scoffs and shouts of a miscreant rabble. Vallejo would have removed his irons, but Columbus would not consent. They had been imposed by the authority of their majesties, and, said he, "I will wear them until they shall order them to be taken off, and I will preserve them as relics and memorials of the reward of my services." He did so, adds his son. "I saw them always hanging in his cabinet, and he requested that when he died they might be buried with him." That guy does not let things go. When Columbus arrived in irons at Cadiz from the world that he had discovered, a universal burst of indignation was heard throughout Spain, and was responded to by the whole of the civilized world. Even the cold, heartless monarch quailed before it. and had to express his reprobation of such unworthy treatment. Columbus was ordered to be set free and was received with many marks of favor at court, and the charges against him were never listened to. But the true vindication of his conduct, that which justice strongly demanded, was withheld, notwithstanding repeated solicitations. He was not restored to his viceroyalty. And Ferdinand, while disowning the crime, retained its fruits. Many voyages to and discoveries in the New World had recently taken place, not only among his own subjects, but by other nations. Sebastian Cabot in 1497 had coasted along North America from Labrador to Florida in an English ship fitted out by Henry VII, and Cabral, a Portuguese, in a voyage to India, had discovered in April 1500 the coast of Brazil. Ferdinand thus saw his new dominions expanding to a boundless extent, and in danger of being encroached on by other nations. He had long repented of the powers granted to Columbus, and every new discovery made him repine the more at the reward conferred on a foreigner, whose services could now be dispensed with. Ovando was appointed to supersede Bobadilla in the government, for which the latter had shown himself wholly incapable. For this, various excuses were assigned to Columbus, and a promise given him of being restored to his office in 2 years, when all angry passions were allayed, and affairs restored to order. Ovando was fitted out with great splendor, and his departure hastened by the reports of the evil results of the administration of Bobadilla. This person had parceled out the natives among the white men, who, well aware that the time of license would be but short, exercised the most capricious tyranny, and compelled them to work in the mines by the most inhumane cruelties. Ovando left Spain in February 1502 with a fleet of 30 sail, containing about 2,500 persons. In a storm which it encountered, one ship with 120 passengers was lost, and the rumor that the whole fleet had perished spread consternation throughout Spain, but afterward proved unfounded. While these events were taking place, Columbus remained with the court at Granada, endeavoring to restore his affairs, and at the same time to excite the sovereign to undertake an expedition to recover the Holy Sepulchre from the infidels. This seems to have been the leading object in his mind, to which all his great discoveries were only preparatory, but possibly receiving no encouragement, he returned again to the old path. He therefore requested permission to fit out a new expedition, the object of which was to search for some channel between the countries already discovered, leading directly to the rich realms of Eastern Asia. The king gladly granted his request, as putting off for a time more troublesome claims, and as likely to gratify his own cupidity. Before setting out, Columbus wrote to the Pope, excusing his delay in visiting His Holiness, to give a personal account of his discoveries, and explaining the causes that prevented his expedition to the Holy Sepulchre. He also transmitted 2 copies of all the letters and grants he had received from the sovereigns, with an account of his discoveries and a vindication of his rights, to a friend in Genoa, showing his well-founded fear of Spanish ingratitude and his desire to secure his own dear-bought fame. Having arranged these matters, he left Cadiz in May 1502 on the 4th and last voyage, accompanied by his son Fernando and his brother Bartholomew. He had 4 small vessels, the largest only 71 tons burden. After touching the coast of Morocco and at the Canaries, he reached the Caribbean islands in the middle of June. From this, he steered by Santa Cruz and Puerto Rico for San Domingo, where he wished to exchange one of his vessels which sailed extremely ill. This course was contrary both to his own plan and the orders of the king, by which he had been forbidden to touch on Hispaniola. Columbus anchored off the town on the 29th of June and asked permission of Ovando to enter the harbor, stating the purpose for which he had come and his dread of an approaching storm. Ovando had now been some time in office, and his fleet was about to return, having on board Bombardier, Guarinoex, once cacique of the fertile Vega, and an immense quantity of gold collected by the oppression of the natives. One piece of gold, the grano de oro, as it is called in the old chronicles, was particularly famous, weighing, according to best computation, about 40 pounds troy English. Ovando refused to allow Columbus to enter the harbor, and neglected his repeated warning to delay the sailing of the fleet. It left the harbor, but in 2 days was overtaken by an awful hurricane. The ship containing Bobadilla, Roldan, and some others of the most inveterate enemies of Columbus, with all their ill-gotten wealth, was swallowed up in the ocean, and only one vessel, the weakest of the fleet, and containing some property of Columbus, could continue her voyage to Spain. The admiral had sailed along the coast, expecting the storm to be from the land, and, sheltered by it, reached Port Hermoso without so much damage. Columbus regarded his own safety almost as miraculous, while the destruction of his enemies was ascribed to divine interposition by his contemporaries. Columbus, after refitting his vessels, sailed for the mainland, which he reached on the coast of Honduras. Here he met with a large canoe containing a cacique and family who seemed to have come from a long journey, bringing with them articles of copper and manufactures of a superior kind to any yet seen among the natives. The Indians pointed out to him a rich country in the west, probably Yucatan or Mexico, but Columbus turned east, looking for the supposed strait. He made but slow progress, being opposed by the winds and currents and a tempest which he says surpassed in violence and duration any he had ever seen. At last they doubled a cape, which he named Gracias a Dios, as the coast turning direct south gave them a free navigation and favorable wind. They stopped at a river to take in wood and water, but the sudden swell of the sea in the estuary swamped one of the boats, whose whole crew perished. Leaving this melancholy place, Columbus next anchored near an Indian village named Cariari, where he was kindly entertained and remained some time to refresh his men. He next sailed along the region afterward named Costa Rica, or the Rich Coast, from the mines of the precious metals found in its mountains, and in his traffic with the natives procured for the merest trifles several large plates of gold, which they wore as ornaments. Many reports of countries in the west rich in gold and silver were communicated to him, and probably had reference to Mexico or Peru. But instead of following these, he continued east, looking for an imaginary strait that was to open up a passage to the east. He next touched at a harbor named Puerto Bello from its beauty, and afterward was forced to take shelter in a small port, so deep that there was no anchorage till the ships almost touched the land. The sailors used to leap on shore during the night, and so provoked their Indians by their bad conduct that they assembled in great numbers to attack the ships, but were dispersed on the first discharge of artillery. Here Columbus, despairing of finding any passage through the mainland, turned back to explore the rich country he had left behind. The wind, which had opposed their eastward progress for 3 months, now suddenly changed to the west, and they were driven out to sea by a tremendous storm which continued for 9 days. The sea boiled like a cauldron, and at night the waves resembled great surges of flame. The thunder and lightning were almost incessant, and the rain poured down in torrents into their open vessels. One day a water-spout passed close by the ships, but without injuring them, and after great difficulties they at last reached the river Belen on the coast of Veragua. Here he remained some time, till his brother, the Adelantado, investigated the country and found it very rich in gold. Columbus again imagined that he found one of the places where Solomon had procured his unbounded wealth, and resolved to found a new colony. 80 men were to remain with the Adelantado, while Columbus returned to Spain for supplies. Their various arrangements were soon completed, but the river, lately swollen by rains in the mountains, was now so shallow that his vessels could not pass over the bar at its mouth, and he was detained till another inundation should set them free. Meantime, Quibian, the cacique of the Indians, resolved to expel the unwelcome guests and collected his warriors. Diego Mendez, notary to the fleet, suspected their designs, and venturing boldly into their camp, had his suspicions confirmed. A native, too, revealed the plot of his countrymen to the admiral. They intended to attack the fort by night, set it on fire, and kill all the white men. The Adelantado resolved to anticipate them, and marching into their camp with 75 men, seized Quibian and sent him away captive in a boat. But the wily savage contrived to free himself from his bonds, plunged into the sea, and escaped. Returning to his dwelling, he found it wasted, and his family carried away into captivity. The admiral had now put out to sea, and was only waiting for a fair wind. Before he could sail, however, the Indians had attacked the fort, and, though repulsed, had again assembled in great numbers, massacred a boat's crew, which had been sent on shore for wood, and shut the Spaniards up within their defenses. The admiral was in great anxiety for his brother, the high surf preventing any communication with the shore, when during the night he heard a mysterious voice reproaching him with his want of faith in God, who had given him the keys to unlock the gates of the ocean sea, shut by such mighty chains. Immediately after this vision, the sea became calm, and the Adelantado, with his followers, embarked on board the vessels, leaving the settlement deserted. The family of the cacique confined in the ships had partly escaped, and partly destroyed themselves in despair at leaving their native land. Columbus now sailed for Hispaniola, but the winds and currents carried him far west of his appointed port. One of the caravels had been left in the river Belen, another was so wasted that it had to be deserted on the voyage, and the 2 that remained were so honeycombed by the Teredo, another new word, Teredo, by the Teredo, as to be scarcely seaworthy. Columbus tried to beat up to Hispaniola, but all his efforts were in vain, and at last, fearing his vessels might founder at sea, he had to run them aground on the coast of Jamaica, where they were soon filled with water. He then built thatched cabins on the prow and stern for the crews, and remained castled in the sea. His trusty follower, Diego Mendez, went on shore and arranged with the Indians to supply them with provisions, and then offered to proceed to Hispaniola in an Indian canoe to ask relief. With him, Columbus sent letters to the sovereigns, giving a most glowing description of the land now discovered, and indulging in romantic visions contrasting strangely with his actual condition. Broken down by age and infirmities, racked with pain, confined to his bed, and shut up in a wreck on the coast of a remote and savage island. Mendez set out on his expedition, accompanied by 1 Spaniard and 6 Indians. He reached the end of the island, but was taken prisoner by some hostile Indians who determined to kill them. He contrived to escape in his canoe and returned to the ships, where he offered to make a second attempt. He was now accompanied in another canoe by a Genoese named Fiesco, while the Adelantado guarded them along the coast. Taking advantage of a calm day, the canoes set sail and soon lost sight of land. But on the second day, the water was almost exhausted, and one of the Indians died under the heat and labor. In the evening, even the leaders had begun to despair, when the rising moon showed them the Isle of Navassa, a mere barren rock, but containing water in hollow clefts. They remained here for a day, living on shellfish, and on the 4th day reached Hispaniola, distant about 100 miles from Jamaica. Mendez proceeded along the coast for San Domingo, but hearing that the governor was in Jaragua, he left his canoe and proceeded overland to meet him. Ovando promised to send immediate relief, but delayed from day to day and month to month. A new misfortune had in the meantime befallen Columbus. Part of the crew, led by a person of the name of Porras, rose in mutiny, and seizing some canoes that Columbus had bought from the natives, deserted him and the sick, and resolved to sail for Hispaniola. They took what arms and provisions they chose, and proceeded along the coast, plundering and abusing the Indians. They made 2 attempts to leave the island, but were driven back by the wind, and then wandered about the country, supporting themselves by robbing the natives. Columbus, by skillful arrangements, had recruited the health and spirits of those who remained with him, but the Indians began to relax in supplying him with provisions, and as the toys given in payment became more common, asked far higher price for what they had brought. In this extremity, Columbus, knowing that on a particular night an eclipse of the moon would take place, resolved to use it to intimidate the natives. He assembled all the caciques and told them that the God of the heavens, whom he and his people worshipped, was angry with the Indians for refusing them supplies, and meant to punish them with famine and pestilence. As a token of this, they would that night see the moon become dark and change in color. Some of the Indians derided the prediction, but when they saw the dark shadow stealing over the moon, they were seized with terror and hurried to the ships with provisions, entreating Columbus to intercede to avert the threatened calamity. Columbus retired to his cabin to commune with the deity, while the Indians filled the woods with their wild lamentations. And when the eclipse was about to diminish, Columbus came forth and told that he had prevailed with God on their behalf, and that they would be pardoned on condition of fulfilling their promises, in sign of which the darkness would now withdraw from the moon. Columbus was thenceforth regarded by the Indians with awe, as possessed of supernatural powers, and from that time no want of provisions was felt in the ships. 8 months had now passed away, with no prospect of relief, and a new mutiny was about to break out, when one evening a vessel was seen off the harbor. Next day a boat came from it to the ships, in which was Escobar, one of the former rebels against Columbus. He had been sent by Ovando, probably as a spy, for after a short conversation with Columbus and giving him a letter from the governor, he departed. The crew were much disappointed at this desertion, but were reassured by the admiral, who said that Escobar's vessel was too small to take the whole, and that he had sailed for larger ships. Columbus afterward sent a messenger to the mutineers, offering them a free pardon and passage home, provided they would return to obedience. Porras rejected all conditions, and to render his men hopeless of forgiveness, resolved to attack and plunder the ships. Columbus sent his brother to meet them, who again offered them pardon, but confident in their numbers, the rebels would listen to no terms and attacked the Adelantado. They were well received by this experienced soldier, who took Porras captive with his own hand, when his followers fled, leaving several slain. Next day, the fugitives sent a petition for pardon, binding themselves to obedience by horrid imprecations. Columbus granted this request, and at length, after a year of delay, 2 vessels arrived, one fitted out by Mendez at the admiral's expense, the other by Ovando, whose long neglect had roused the public indignation so that even the clergy were condemning it from the pulpit. On the 28th of June, 1504, Columbus took leave of the wreck which had been so long his home, amid the tears of the Indians who regretted the departure of their celestial visitants. On the 13th of August, he anchored at San Domingo, where he was received with the highest marks of distinction by the people, in which the governor saw fit to agree. There was, however, no friendly feelings. There was, however, no friendly feelings between them, and Columbus found reason to complain of the way in which the island, where he had so strong an interest, had been governed. The condition to which Hispaniola had been reduced during the absence of Columbus is the best refutation of the calumnies of his enemies. Ovando had been accompanied to the island by a large band of adventurers who, on their arrival, set out for the mines, but unaccustomed to labor and ignorant of the method of collecting the precious metals, soon exhausted their store of provisions without any result, and returned in utter poverty to the town, where more than 1,000 of them died of want and disease. Isabella had ordered the Indians to be set free, when they, of course, refused to labor in the mines. A new decree was then obtained by which they were to work a short time for hire, and in order to aid in their conversion. On this pretense, they were anew portioned out among their former masters, who treated them with the most brutal cruelty. Las Casas, an eyewitness, says, they were compelled to labor by the lash, fed on unsubstantial cassava bread, and so sparingly that they scrambled like dogs under the table for the bones thrown to them by their masters, and when at last dismissed, they were found dead on the road home, or lying gasping under the trees, faintly crying, "Hunger, hunger." Many fled to the mountains, others killed themselves in despair, and before 12 years from its discovery was over, before 12 years from its first discovery was over, several hundred thousands of its once happy natives had been sacrificed to the lust and avarice of the white men. A more striking fate was reserved for the people of Charagua, still independent and governed by Anaconda, the wife of Caonabo, formerly mentioned. Ovando marched thither with 300 men and was received in the most friendly manner by the natives. On a Sunday afternoon, he assembled the chiefs and people to witness a mock fight among his soldiers, but at an appointed signal took all the caciques who had met in his lodgings, to the number of 80, prisoners, forced them by torture a confession of guilt, and then consumed them in the flames of the house. His troops, meanwhile, massacred the naked and defenseless Indians, shut up in a square whence they could not escape. The excuse for this treachery was an alleged conspiracy of the natives, for which Anaconda was subsequently hanged and the fertile country reduced to a desolate wilderness. Another province, Higuey, which was still independent, but the Spaniards soon penetrated there also, and after an obstinate but unavailing resistance, massacred or subdued the people, and taking the cacique prisoner, hanged him like a common felon. In this war, the Spaniards committed deeds of hard and atrocious cruelty, such as cannot even now be related, so that their countrymen, Las Casas says, all these things and others revolting to human nature, my own eyes beheld, and now I almost fear to repeat them, scarce believing myself, or whether I have not dreamed them. Such was the state of the once rich and happy island when Columbus returned to it after his long absence, more like a region given as a prey to evil spirits than the earthly paradise he originally imagined it. He left it for Spain on the 12th of September, 1504, after assisting from his private funds many of the companions of his misfortunes, some of whom had been the most violent among the rebels. His vessel suffered from much tempest. His vessel suffered much from tempest, and he himself was confined to bed by the gout, but arrived in Spain on the 7th of November and took up his residence at Seville. Trouble followed him even here, the revenue he should have received from the Indians being withheld by the governor, and his remonstrances to the king unheeded. The calumnies of his enemies prevailed against him, though he had, in his own words, served their majesties with as much zeal and diligence as if it had been to gain paradise. His best friend was now gone, Isabella having died on the 26th of November of deep melancholy caused by the death of her favorite children. Columbus remained in Seville during the winter, his health not permitting him to proceed to court, where the king received all his applications for justice with cold indifference. In May he was able to travel to Segovia, where he had an interview with Ferdinand, who received him with cold professions of kindness and evasive promises. The king never meant to keep his word. A little more delay, a little more disappointment, a little more infliction of ingratitude, and this loyal and generous heart would cease to beat. He should then be delivered from the just claims of a well-tried servant, who, in ceasing to be useful, was considered by him to have become importunate. And this event was now at hand. Tortured by disease and despairing of justice, Columbus, having made a will settling all his affairs with scrupulous exactness, and performed the pious offices required by his religion, expired with great resignation on the 20th of May, 1506, in about the 70th year of his age. His remains were first deposited in the convent of San Francisco, whence they were transferred in 1513 to a monastery at Seville, and in 1536, along with the body of his son Diego, were transported to Hispaniola and interred in the cathedral of San Domingo. Even there they were not destined to rest in peace, but in 1795, when the island was given up to France, were removed to Havana in Cuba. Ferdinand erected a monument to his memory, or rather of his own ingratitude, inscribed thus: "For Castile and Leon, Columbus found a new world." The true monument of the great Genoese is the vast continent he made known to mankind, his true reward, the gratitude of posterity, and the fame that will attend him to the latest ages. His actions show his character in its truest and noblest light, especially when contrasted with those of his contemporaries, and with whom he came into immediate contact. His imagination was ardent and apt to lead him astray, but regulated by a knowledge of science rare in those days. His ambition was lofty and soaring, and thus the source of much misfortune to him. He was not satisfied by common rewards, but sought others, which the haughty dignity of the Spanish monarch felt degraded by granting, and the very importance of his services became a reason for withholding from him his due reward. Avarice seems to have influenced his mind less than honor and dignity, and he was always more disposed to maintain his authority by mildness than severity. His conduct to the poor Indians in the darkest spot his conduct to the poor Indians is the darkest spot on his character, and when we read of the misery and destruction his discovery entailed on that unoffending race, we almost feel as if his own sufferings were demanded by justice. Though he often tried to defend the native from the oppressions of his followers, we cannot forget that it was his constant appeals to the low avarice of the Spanish court and the visions of gold and precious stones by which he endeavored to prove the value of his discoveries that drew to the New World that horde of lawless ruffians who were the great cause of all his trials. He led out colonies by the hope of gold, wrested from the hands of weak and defenseless savages, and his reckless followers, balked of their prey, turned on him as a deceiver. This curse of the greed of gold has adhered to the Spanish colonies even to the present day, like a malignant pestilence, wasting their strength and never suffering them to take root in the land. It is but justice to this great man to remark that many of his errors were those of his time, and that even the Church justified his treatment of the natives. His loftiest imaginings also fell short of the wonderful reality. How would his magnanimous spirit have been consoled, says his eloquent historian, amid the afflictions of age and the cares of penury, to neglect of a fickle public and the injustice of an ungrateful king, could he have anticipated the splendid empires which were to spread over the beautiful world he had discovered, and the nations, tongues, and languages which were to fill its lands with his renown, and to revere and bless his name to the latest posterity. It may not be uninteresting to mention the subsequent fortunes of the family of Columbus. He was succeeded in his rights as a viceroy in the New World by his son Diego, described as a man of great integrity and respectable talents, and of a frank and gentle disposition. He came forward to claim the restitution of the family offices and privileges, but Ferdinand was not inclined to bestow on the son what he had withheld from the higher merit of the father. After 2 years' vain solicitation, Diego only obtained leave to prosecute his claim in the ordinary courts of law. The suit, commenced in 1508 and continued for several years, was decided in his favor, but the court had no power to enforce compliance on the monarch. At last, Diego, having married a niece of the celebrated Duke of Alva, the chief favorite of the king, the monarch yielded to this powerful influence what he had denied to justice. Ovando was recalled in compliance with a promise long before made to the queen on her deathbed, and Diego appointed with the same powers. He went out to San Domingo in 1500 with his wife, his 2 uncles, and his brother, and ruled with a degree of splendor hitherto unknown. But he could not reform the abuses that had crept into the colony. Factious men still disputed his authority, and the oppression and destruction of the Indians continued. In 1519, Cuba was colonized, and the mines in Hispaniola being exhausted, the culture of the sugarcane, a more certain source of riches, was introduced. On the representation of the Dominican friars, the labor of the natives was diminished, and the Negro slaves from Africa employed instead, but treated with a barbarity surpassing even that inflicted on the Indians. In 1515, Diego repaired to court to answer charges brought against him, but though his innocence was admitted, he continued involved in long and troublesome litigation with the fiscal officers of the crown. He returned to the island in 1520, but was recalled about 3 years afterward, and spent the rest of his life in vain endeavor to obtain justice from the court, having died near Toledo in 1526. His wife claimed the inheritance for his son, Don Luis, who, finding his dignities and privileges sources of vexation to himself, resigned them to the Emperor Charles V, and in return was created Duke of Veragua, and received a fixed sum of money for his claim to a tenth of the produce of the Indies. Bought off for a seashell too, huh? Okay, so the grandson of Columbus received a fixed sum of money for his claim to a tenth of the produce of the... Man, that was a really good deal, too. Imagine how rich they could have been for a tenth. Aye, Columbus tried. He sure did. In 1578, all the legitimate male heirs of Columbus were extinct, and a long lawsuit commenced, which was at last decided in favor of Don Nuno de Portugallo, a branch of the Portuguese House of Braganza, and the great-grandson of Diego, the eldest son of Columbus. Columbus's brother, the Adelantado, survived him several years, but was never employed in any office of importance, the king being jealous of the too great influence of this family. Fernando, the second son of Columbus, made several voyages to the New World and also traveled over many parts of Europe, Asia, and Africa. He possessed good natural abilities and studious habits, and collected a library of more than 20,000 volumes, which he left to the Cathedral of Seville, where he died in 1539, aged about 51 years. He wrote several works, the only one of which that is known being his history of his father, the admiral. It is singular that this history only exists in Spanish, a retranslation from an Italian translation of the original. This has given rise to many errors in names and dates, but the work is still entitled to great credit, and forms the foundation of all the biographies of Columbus, one of the best and fullest of which is the production of Washington Irving. It is to this work we have been chiefly indebted in drawing up this account of the fortunes of the illustrious Genoese, whose merits have survived all calumny and are indelibly inscribed on the history of the world. Oh, I guess Columbus wasn't that bad. I guess we give him a hard time when I guess he wasn't as bad as he could have been.